How often should a student pilot fly? Every how long should a student pilot show up and take a flight lesson? That's a great question. In fact, it's something I talk about with every single one of my new clients. And I'm sure if you've gone through flight training, it's something that you had to think about and answer for yourself. Because really, how often someone flight trains is dependent on a few things that are general, but then also on a few specific personal things. Meaning, it's just like running. Running at a certain pace affects one person's body very differently than it does another person's. So, in general, to answer that question, there's some general things that we need to consider.
Flight rules, twin turboprop entering.
There's some general things we need to consider, and there's also personal things we need to consider, which we'll talk about here in this video. So, great question. How often should a student pilot train? So, the first thing we need to understand about flight training, but really it's not just flight training, it's about every single thing every single time we acquire and learn a new skill. So any training you do, we need to understand this crucial piece about it. And it goes like this. Between the time of your last session, last time you visit a topic, to the time that you visit it again, show up again to a flight lesson. This specific topic in our case is a flight lesson. When that period of time is high or goes up as opposed to low, meaning the more time that has passed since your last session to this one, the longer the period that I specifically call, I'm sure there's a professional term to it, but I call this period the catch-up period. So every single flight lesson, those of you who just started out, especially in the beginning, it happens a lot more than ever, but it always happens, but in the beginning, it's those catch-up periods are longer. A catch-up period is every single time you show up to a new flight lesson, there is a given amount of time you will spend in that lesson bringing yourself up to par to the point where you left off last lesson. I'll say that again. Every single time you show up to a flight lesson, you will spend a given amount of time. It could be 10 minutes, it could be 5 minutes, it could be 30 minutes. You will spend a given amount of time getting your body and your brain and your thinking warmed up. So now you're exactly at that point that you left last sessions at, okay? Because what doesn't happen, and this is not how the world, it's just not how the world works. You don't leave a session, then show up 4 days later, and you start out immediately right where you left off. It doesn't work that way. There's a warm-up period that takes place. I call that the catch-up period. You're catching up. So here's something really interesting that happens. The longer time that has passed since your last session to this one, I find that your catch-up period gets longer. Which makes sense if you think about it. The longer it's been since I've done something, the longer I'll need to warm up to get myself to the same proficiency level that I left that thing when I last touched it. Makes sense. So if my session was a week ago, and my catch-up period is 20 minutes, we could assume that if your last session was 2 weeks ago, you'll have a catch-up period of a little more than 20 minutes. That's just generally speaking true. So, the first thing I'll say about how often should my flight sessions be? The answer is this. Often enough to where your catch-up periods are not eating into the majority of your session, to where you're losing money, meaning you're moving backwards. You're not moving forward. So you want your sessions to be close enough to each other to where you give your catch-up period the room and the attention it deserves, but not letting it hijack the majority of your session. Meaning, if it needs to be 20 minutes, be at 20 minutes, assuming your session is 2-3 hours. Does that make sense? Okay. So it should be often enough to where your catch-up periods don't get too crazy long. But it should also be, is the word seldom? It should also be far enough apart to where you have enough time to go home and to let the information sink in your head. And these things take time. It's just like lifting weights at the gym. The muscles don't grow at the gym. They grow when you sleep. All these things download when you're home, not in the airplane. So we have to give some time for things to sink in and settle. We have to. So the short answer to how often should a student pilot train is this. There's not one answer for all people, because just like weights at the gym, and just like with catch-up periods, everyone's different. Some people's catch-up period after a month of not touching a plane is surprisingly short, and that's just how they are. Bravo. Other people's catch-up period after touching the plane 2 days ago is surprisingly long. That's how they are. There's no right or wrong here. So figure out what your typical catch-up period is. How long do you need to give you to get yourself to the point where you left off last session? Figure that out. And then also figure out, how long do I need to give me between sessions to where I'm not showing up each session feeling like I'm not learning anything because I'm just doing it too rapid back to back. So really the answer to how often should I train or show up to schedule sessions? Because remember, your instructor, hopefully your instructor knows this information and is being transparent with you and honest and saying, listen, let's find that sweet spot together. Hopefully that's the case. But if that's not the case, you need to figure it out for yourself. So you really want to pay attention and say, okay, how long am I spending each session to where I reach a point where I go, okay, I feel good. I'm one with the airplane. I'm warmed up. And then also figure out, how long do I need to go home and spend time on my own thinking about the information, taking notes, studying, whatever it might be, in order to let all that sink in. And the answer will be different for everyone, but you have to honor these two things, and they're both opposite each other. They're both opposite each other. On the one hand, you don't want to go too long between sessions, because then your catch-up period gets completely not economically worth it. But you also don't want to do them too back-to-back, because then you don't give time to things to settle, just like working out at the gym. If you lift weights every hour, you're not giving your muscles a break. So that's one. And that is a general thing that applies to everyone. The specific amount of time is different for people, but everyone have a catch-up period, and everyone needs time for things to settle in their head. That is true for everyone. Now, on an individual basis, everyone's different for many, many reasons. Lifestyle. Are you married with 4 kids? Are you single? How much time do you have to devote to this? How much time do you want to spend training? Could you afford doing as many sessions as you otherwise would if you could afford it? There's so many variables that go into how often someone flight trains, beyond what I just discussed with the catch-up period and letting things sink in. There's so many variables. So specifically to those variables, unfortunately, I can't really speak to that or answer that question. People have to figure that out for themselves. But what I want you to take away from this is this. Assuming you could afford to fly as much as you want, assuming you have all the time in the world, assuming everything's great, train often enough to where you're not spending the majority of the next session getting yourself up to par. And give yourself enough time between sessions to where you actually are letting things sink in and learning and absorbing the information. All that said, what I find works really well, is twice a week, maybe 3 times a week. Once a week, I find for most people, is too far between sessions, especially when you're learning a skill that is so new and so different, like flying. I'll give you an example. If you are someone who says, you know what, I've always been to race cars, I want to go to racing school. Okay, and now they put you in a nice Porsche, and there's a nice track, and they teach you stuff. Here's how you drift, or not drift. Here's how you cut corners. They teach you stuff. Yes, that's a new skill, but you've driven cars your whole life, right? So you know how the steering wheel works. You know what the gas pedal does. You know what the brake does, right? So you're showing up to that type of new skill, new learning, with a general given amount of idea of, okay, I kind of know what's going on, but maybe I'm not as tight as they want me to be in terms of performance. But that's an example of a skill that you show up with a good amount of idea of, you know, what's going on, because you've driven cars your whole life. But airplanes are so new and so different, and there's so many concepts that are so contradictory to how we naturally think as human beings who live on an Earth's surface and don't float in 3D and suspended midair. It's so different. And because of that, that's even more so a reason to not let that time between sessions get too long. Because if it does, you're just spending the entire next session catching up, if that, right? So you gotta keep it consistent and close enough to each other to your brain is picking things up. Oh yeah, and it takes doing that for a little bit to hammer these things in, consistency, in order for you to wrap your head around, okay, I get it now, here's how the plane works, here's what happens when I pitch up, here's that. All these concepts are really, really, really new. So I hope this is good enough and helpful for you for an answer if you're someone out there who's trying to figure out how often should I schedule my sessions. All those specific answers that are pertain to you specifically, I really can't answer. You could figure out how much time could I devote to it. Am I, again, married, single? Do I have time? Do I have money? Whatever it might be. But once you've done that, the thing I could tell you, and this is coming from someone I train people, often enough to where your catch-up periods are not insanely high or long, and with enough room between sessions to where you're giving yourself and your mind enough time to absorb and learn new information. And be honest with yourself, whatever that period of time is. Like I said before, generally speaking, what I find that twice a week, 2 sessions a week, and you got to be consistent, because remember, twice a week with a week off, now you've gone for a week and a half or 2 weeks without touching a plane. Consistent. Twice a week is a good thing. 3 times a week maybe, depending on who you are. 4 times a week is too much. Once a week is too little. That's what I find generally speaking, but it's different for everyone. So that's my 2 cents on how often should a student pilot fly. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, as always, send me an email. There's an email in the description box of this video. And as this question and as all questions, I write down all the top questions that I get from people over time, and I talk about them as I have time in the airplane flying. So I hope that was helpful to you, and I'm looking forward to hearing your question in my email. So I'll talk to you guys next time.